Hi, welcome back to the Story Lady. Today we're going to continue with The World According to Humphrey. We'll begin on Chapter 3. Chapter 3, The Two Faces of Mrs. Brisbane. That week was busy, but I learned a lot. I learned all the capitals of the United States. I didn't say I remembered them all, but I learned them all. I learned about how water changes from solid to liquid to gas. I learned how to subtract fractions. I learned something else. Something very weird. There are two Mrs. Brisbanes. And I thought one Mrs. Brisbane was one too many. The first Mrs. Brisbane is a good teacher, just like Aldo said. She's better than Mrs. Mack was at getting AJ to lower his voice. She's better at getting Heidi to raise her hand before she blurts something out loud. Of course, nobody could get Speak Up Saya to raise her hand or to blurt anything out loud. Saya is so quiet and gentle, she never gives an answer. If the teacher calls on her, she stares down at her desk without saying a word. But when it's Saya's turn to clean my cage and feed me, she holds me in her hand so gently. I feel like I'm floating on a cloud. Hello, Humphrey, she whispers. Your fur is so beautiful. I always feel calmer when Saya holds me. She's so nice. I wish Mrs. Brisbane would leave her alone. Miss Mack hardly ever called on Saya once she realized how shy she was. But Mrs. Brisbane calls on her all the time. She won't leave her alone. Saya, speak up, please. I know you know the answer, she'd say while Saya stared at the top of her desk as if she were watching a TV show there. But I was shocked when Mrs. Brisbane got annoyed with Saya, sweet, shy Saya, and said, You will stay in during recess. Saya still stared down without moving a muscle. But a minute later, I saw something wet drop from Saya's eyes to the tabletop. I hated Mrs. Brisbane. Of course, I don't go out to recess. In fact, I'm glad, since it's a great time to catch up on my sleep. So I was there when Mrs. Brisbane talked to Saya, and I was all ready to squeak up on her behalf, if necessary. Mrs. Brisbane brought a stack of papers to the table and sat down across from Saya. Saya, you think I'm being mean to you, don't you? Saya slowly shook her head. No. I heartily nodded my head, yes, but no one was looking at me. But I wouldn't call on you if I didn't know that you know the answers, the teacher explained. Look at your papers and tests. You get 100% on everything. Spelling, science, geography, and arithmetic. Your vocabulary is excellent, but I have never heard you speak. Can you tell me why? I checked my notebook and I was pretty impressed. I only got an 85% on the last vocabulary test. This girl is smart. Saya still did not speak. Say I am going to have to send a note home to your parents. Maybe they can help me figure out what to do, said Mrs. Brisbane. Saya looked up very frightened. No, please, she said. Mrs. Brisbane looked surprised. She reached over and patted Saya's arm. I won't send a note now, if you'll promise to try. Saya looked back down at the desk and nodded. I'll tell you what, I won't call on you if you promise that sometime within the next week you'll raise your hand on your own and answer a question. Is that a deal? Saya nodded very slowly this time. You have to say it, Mrs. Brisbane told her. Deal, Saya whispered. Terrific, said Mrs. Brisbane, smiling. Now, how would you like to erase the board for me? Saya jumped up and hurried to the board. All the students in room 26 liked to erase the board for some reason. Mrs. Brisbane was sure hard to figure out. She hadn't been mean to Saya at all. She just did what a teacher is supposed to do. I like this, Mrs. Brisbane. I even like the pink blouse she had on. But at the end of the day, when the students were gone, the second Mrs. Brisbane came back, the really scary one, she straightened up the room and came over to the window to close the blinds. I could only hope that Aldo would open them for me later. She looked down and saw that the table around me was messy. The bag of shavings used for my bedding and torn in bits of litter were scattered all over the table. Garth had done the cleaning and left the lid off my treat box. The whole table looked untidy. Good grief, said Mrs. Brisbane in a very unhappy voice. I decided to take a spin on my wheel. Usually that cheers people up, but not Mrs. Brisbane. She started to clean the table, getting paper towels and cleaning spray and muttering to herself the whole time. Not my job, she grumbled. These children are not responsible. All I need is somebody else to take care of. Some rodent. Nobody says rodent quite the way Mrs. Brisbane does. Then she looked down at me with angry eyes and said, You are a troublemaker, and somehow I'm going to get rid of you. Then she grabbed her purse and her papers and stormed out of room 26. For once, I didn't mind being left alone. I didn't even mind the tick, tick, tick of the clock. I was just glad that the second Mrs. Brisbane was gone. I was worried about what she'd said, but I kept my mind occupied by practicing my vocabulary words until the light was completely gone. If say I got 100% correct, why couldn't I? Then I sat and waited. Suddenly, bright lights blinded my eyes as the door swung open and the familiar voice roared, "Never fear, Aldo's here." Aldo rode his cart over to my cage and put his face right down next to mine. "How's it going, Humphrey?" he asked. I tried squeaking out my story, but Aldo didn't quite catch what I was saying. "Whoa, pal, something's got your tail in a tizzy. Well, this should cheer you up." Aldo reached into a brown paper bag, pulled something out, and dangled it in front of my cage. "Something to gnaw on, little buddy," he said, opening the door. "Joy, joy, joy, a tiny dog biscuit. One of Miss Mac's friends gave me one of these once. You can crunch on it forever." "Ha-ha!" Suddenly there's a smile on your face. Aldo beamed with pride. "Now clean this room real fast so we can eat our dinner together." I never saw anybody move as fast as Aldo. He turned the music up full blast. Then he mopped and polished and swept and scrubbed while I nibbled and gnawed on my biscuit. When he was finished, Aldo pulled a chair up to my cage and took out his big sandwich. "You know, Humphrey, some folks might think I'm crazy talking to a hamster, but you're better company than a lot of people I know. Here, have a nice salad. It's good for you." He tore off a tiny piece of lettuce and pushed it through the wires of my cage. "Thank you," I squeaked. "You're welcome," said Aldo. "So what were we talking about last night?" "Oh yeah, loneliness. You know, I have friends, Humphrey, but during the day when I'd like to do something, go bowling or to a movie or something, they're at work. And when they want to do something, I'm at work. Of course, there's the weekend, but I usually see my family, you know. My brother and his family, my nieces and nephews. I got a big family." Suddenly, Aldo bopped the side of his head with the palm of his hand. "Whoa, Humphrey, I never told you. My nephew, he's in your class. Richie Rinaldi. He's just over there." He pointed to the far side of the room. "He always has the neatest desk in the class. He better or he'll hear from his uncle. Do you know him?" "Of course," I squeaked. "Repeat that, please, Richie. One of the nicest boys in the class." But he mumbled a lot and usually had to repeat something 2 or 3 times to be understood. Aldo crunched his bag and tossed it into his trash can. "Well, I'm out of here. You know, they got a frog in room 16, but he's not good company like you are. He sings nice, though." "Sing? I'll sing for you, Aldo," I thought. Squeak, squeak, squeak. "Don't worry, I don't like him nearly as much as you, my friend," Aldo said. He opened the blinds to let the light in. Just as he was going out the door, Aldo said, "See you next week, Humphrey." Next week, a cold chill came over me. Tomorrow was Friday. When Mrs. Mac was in room 26, she took me home for the weekend. But if Mrs. Brisbane didn't take me home, I'd have 2 very long days and nights with no one, not even Aldo, to feed me or chat with me. Even worse, what if Mrs. Brisbane did take me to her house? What fate would await me there? I had plenty to keep me busy the rest of the night, worrying about Mrs. Brisbane and how she planned to do away with me. "Miss Mac, please come back." Tip 3. Hamsters enjoy a change in routine. Among their favorite activities are eating, grooming themselves, climbing, running, spinning, taking a nap, and being petted. Chapter 4. The most important man in the world. Luckily, Friday went by smoothly. Sorry to say, Saya didn't raise her hand. But Heidi Hopper did. Amazing. AJ actually whispered. Richie cleaned my cage. I tried to imagine him with a big black mustache like his Uncle Aldo. Later, when Mrs. Brisbane asked him to name the capital of Kentucky, Richie said, "Hot dog." Everyone giggled, of course, especially Stop Giggling Gail, otherwise known as Gail Morgenstern. "Repeat that, please, Richie," said the teacher. Richie realized he'd made a mistake, so he tried again. "Frankfurter," he said. More giggles, explosive giggles. "Try again, Richie," said Mrs. Brisbane, who was on the verge of spelling herself. Frankfurt," he said proudly. That was the correct answer, by the way. So you see, it wasn't exactly a bad day in room 26. It's just that I was jittery, wondering what would happen to me when the bell rang. Would I be left alone, hungry, utterly forsaken for 2 whole days? Or would I be a captive in the haunted house of Mrs. Brisbane? At last the bell rang, and the students flew out of the door like a flock of homing pigeons in a movie. Miss Mac showed us. Just then the room mothers stopped by. One was Heidi Hopper's mom, and the other one was Art Paddles. That's Pay Attention Art. They came to talk to Mrs. Brisbane about Halloween, which was less than 2 weeks away. I didn't know what Halloween was, but it sure sounded scary, especially when they talked about bringing bats and witches and even worse, cats right into the classroom. Shiver, quiver, shake. What could they be thinking? I was about ready to fling open the door of my cage and escape when the door opened and in walked the principal, Mr. Morales. Mr. Morales is the most important person at Longfellow School. He runs the place and everyone respects him. You can tell, for one thing, Mr. Morales always wears a tie. No one else in the whole school wears a tie except Mr. Morales. For another thing, when Mr. Morales comes into the room, everyone stops what they're doing and waits to see what he has to say. And for a third thing, both Miss Mack and Mrs. Brisbane sometimes threaten to send a misbehaving student to Mr. Morales' office. As soon as the teacher mentioned the principal's name, the student would start acting very, very nice. "Good afternoon, ladies," said Mr. Morales. He was wearing a light blue shirt and a tie that had tiny books all over it. Everyone said, "Hello. Well, how's your first week back, Sue?" he asked. Sue was apparently Mrs. Brisbane, although I never actually thought of her having a first name before. She said it was great to be back and what a wonderful class it was, which obviously pleased the room's mothers. Then Mr. Morales leaned over my cage and smiled. His tie dangled right over my head. "I'll bet you're enjoying this for a little pupil," he said with a grin. I expected Mrs. Brisbane to tell him what a troublemaking rodent I was, but instead she forced a smile and said, "Well, yes, but he's quite a bit of extra work." Mr. Morales waved a finger at me. He didn't seem to hear what Mrs. Brisbane said. "I always wanted one of these fellows," he said, "but my papa wouldn't let me have one. Sure is cute." Mrs. Brisbane cleared her throat. "Yes, but I'm afraid he's a little distracting. I was going to see if Mr. Kim in room 12 wants him." I was shocked. Luckily, so were the room mothers. "Oh no, the children just love Humphrey," said Mrs. Patel. "Heidi talks about him all the time. And it's a wonderful way to teach the kids responsibility," Mrs. Hopper said. "Yes, but it's a little too much responsibility for me," Mrs. Brisbane sighed. "At least I have a couple days away from him this weekend." "You're not taking him home with you?" asked Mrs. Patel. Mrs. Brisbane backed away from the cage. "Oh no, it's out of the question." "But Miss Mack always took him home," said Mrs. Hopper. "He'll be fine. He has plenty of food," Mrs. Brisbane answered very, very firmly. The room mothers were silent a second. Mr. Morales was still wiggling his finger at me. Then Mrs. Hopper spoke up. "Why don't the kids take turns bringing Humphrey home for the weekend? They can sign up. We'll talk to their parents and give them instructions. It'll be a great experience." "Some people might not want him," said Mrs. Brisbane. "Squeak for yourself, Mrs. Brisbane." "That's fine," said Mrs. Hopper. "There'll be plenty who will." "I think it's great," Mrs. Patel agreed. "I'll take him today, but we're going up to the lake for the weekend." "Oh, I'd take him too," said Mrs. Hopper, "but we're painting the house and the place is a mess. Next week for sure." "Yes, I could do it next week," Mrs. Patel agreed. Mrs. Brisbane smiled a fake smile. "So who's going to take him this weekend?" The room mothers looked at one another. "I could make a few quick calls. Maybe the Rinaldis?" Mrs. Patel suggested. Call, I squeaked. Suddenly, Mr. Morales stood up straight. "I have a better idea," he announced. "I'll take Humphrey home for the weekend. My kids will love him. Then, starting next week, you can have the students take turns." The three women were almost as surprised as I was. "Don't worry, he'll be in good hands," Mr. Morales assured them. Well, I guess I would be. After all, I was going home with the most important person at Longfellow School. As he drove me to his house, Mr. Morales told me how he'd always wanted a hamster when he was a kid, but his dad always said they didn't need another mouth to feed. I argued with him, Humphrey. I said, "Papa, I will feed him off my own plate." Then Papa said we'd have to buy the cage and stuff to put in it. I guess he was right, Humphrey. We couldn't afford it. He smiled his big smile, but not anymore. Now I'm the principal of my own school. I told you he was important. His house was nice, but I didn't get to see much of it because as soon as we came in the door, two little whirlwinds tumbled into the room, shrieking and squealing. "Quiet down now, you'll frighten the little fellow," Mr. Morales told them. He got that right. He introduced us. The little boy, who was about 5, was named Willie. He kept poking his fingers through the wires of the cage. I was about to bite him. Pure instinct. But then I remembered. This is the son of the most important person at Longfellow School. So I didn't. The little girl, who was about 7, was named Brenda. She kept sticking her face up against the cage and squealing. I tried squeaking back at her, but I don't think she could hear me. Mr. Morales tried to quiet them down. He explained that I was a guest for the weekend and they had to treat me with respect. They didn't listen. A pretty lady rushed through the room, jingling her car keys. I'm late. I have a house to show. She glanced in my direction. We'll talk about that later. Adios. Mr. Morales wished her luck and she was gone. Then he carried me into the den with Willie and Brenda clinging to his legs and yelping. My cage was swinging back and forth so much I was getting airsick, or cage sick. Mr. Morales set my cage on a table in their family room. Now get back and listen to me, he told his children. I'll tell you all about him. Can we take him out? Screamed Willie. Can we put him in my room? Shouted Brenda. Can he sleep with me tonight? We can't do anything until you settle down, Mr. Morales said. Bravo, Mr. Morales, I thought. But still the children didn't listen. The most important person at Longfellow School was not treated with respect in his own house. Willie lurched forward and swung open the cage door. Oh, there's poo in there, he screamed. Where? Shrieked Brenda. Willie pointed to my potty corner, which I thought was unspeakably rude of him. I want to hold him, said Brenda, grabbing me. She squeezed me so hard I let out a squeal. Stop, said Mr. Morales. Put him back right now. She opened her hand and dropped me onto the floor of my cage. Luckily, I landed in a pile of soft bedding. Luckily, I didn't land in my poo. I was a little dizzy, but I heard Mr. Morales send Willie and Brenda to their rooms. I will not allow you to mistreat an animal. Upstairs, door shut. No playing until I say you can, he said. Suddenly, Mr. Morales didn't look so important. He slumped down in the chair next to my cage and loosened his tie. Now you know my secret, Humphrey. At school, everybody listens to me. At home, nobody listens to me, he said. Mr. Morales looked tired. Above our heads came the sounds of thumping and bumping. It sounded as if the ceiling was about to fall in. They're bouncing on their beds, Humphrey. Not supposed to do that either, he said. He slowly rose and went to the stairwell in the hall. Willie, Brenda, stop that now, he yelled. Surprisingly, the thumping and bumping stopped. They listened, I squeaked when the principal sat down again. But the thumping and bumping began again in a minute. I wish I knew what to do, he said. Some way to teach them a lesson. I nodded. A lesson is just what those children needed, and I was just the hamster to teach them. Tip 4. Never ever squeeze, pinch, or crush a hamster. If it runs away, squeals or mutters, leave the hamster alone. Join us tomorrow for the starting of Chapter 5.